The stone seats of the selection grounds had been carved into the side of a mountain long before any human had ever set foot on Dreenath. They were wide and deep, built for bodies much larger than a man, and every one of them was full. Dragons of every rank had come to watch. Elders with scales gone gray sat near the top tiers, their long necks craned downward toward the arena floor. Younger dragons packed the lower rows, their wings folded tight, their eyes sharp with interest. This was the day that happened once every generation. The day the Royal Guard chose its next hatchlings. It was not a small thing. On Dreenath, there was no greater honor. The arena floor was wide and flat, made of dark stone that had been scorched so many times over the centuries that it no longer showed individual burn marks. It was just black, uniformly, deeply black, a record of every flame that had ever been tested here, layered one on top of another until the stone itself had changed color permanently. Commander Dravis stood at the edge of the evaluation platform, a raised stone shelf where the selection board observed. He was old by dragon standards, but not frail. His scales were the dark red of cooling embers, and he held himself the way soldiers hold themselves, straight, without effort, because they have been straight for so long that any other posture feels wrong. He had evaluated 3 generations of hatchlings in this arena. He knew what he was looking for before the first one stepped forward. The morning moved quickly. One by one, the young dragons were called to the center of the arena to demonstrate what they were made of. A hatchling with green-black scales breathed a column of fire so wide and hot that the nearest row of observers leaned back in their seats. The crowd rumbled with approval. The board made marks on their slates. Another hatchling, stocky and low to the ground, demonstrated raw physical strength by lifting a stone block that most adult dragons would have struggled with. More approval, more marks. There were 31 hatchlings in total. Each one was the product of careful selection even before this day, years of development, training, expectation. The Royal Guard did not take candidates lightly. The hatchlings who stood here had already been judged worthy enough to try. Most of them were. Rail Dorn sat in the observation section reserved for foreign military representatives. It was a narrow platform off to the side of the main tiers, with a partial view of the floor and a full view of the crowd. He had a small notepad on his knee and a pen that he had not used yet. He was a lean man, not particularly tall, with short dark hair and a face that had spent too many years outdoors. He wore his uniform without decoration. He was a captain in the Human Expeditionary Force, and he had been stationed on Dreenath for 3 years, and in that time, he had learned 2 things with certainty. The first was that dragons were genuinely impressive. The second was that they were extremely confident in their definition of the word impressive. He watched the evaluations with the same focused calm he brought to most things. Not bored, not excited, just watching. The 31st hatchling was called to the floor. He was small. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Not small in the way that some younger hatchlings were small, compact, dense, built low. He was just undersized. His body had the proportions of a dragon that hadn't quite caught up to what it was supposed to be. His scales were pale, almost gray-white, which in dragon culture was considered a bad sign. Not a curse exactly, but a mark of fragility, of something unfinished. He walked to the center of the arena without hurrying and without slouching. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at the black stone in front of him, and then he raised his head. The arena went quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience waiting its turn. The uncomfortable quiet of an audience that already knows what is about to happen and does not know where to look. He breathed. The flame that came out was thin, pale orange at the edges, barely yellow at the center. It wavered slightly, like a candle in a draft, and it died after 2 seconds. The stone in front of him was warm. It was not scorched. The silence that followed was brief, because silence on Dreenath rarely lasted. Low murmurs spread through the crowd. Not cruel, not loud, but present. The sound of an audience that had just watched something confirm what they already suspected. Rail's pen was still, but his eyes were not. He had seen something. Something small and easy to miss if you were looking at the flame itself instead of the dragon producing it. The hatchling had adjusted mid-breath. It was a tiny thing. A shift in the angle of his jaw, a change in the pressure of the exhale, a split-second recalibration that had bent the flame's trajectory slightly to the left before it faded. No hatchling did that. In Rail's 3 years of watching dragon demonstrations, he had never seen a hatchling do that. Young dragons breathed fire the same way a person blinked, instinctively, without thought, as a single unbroken reflex. There was no room in that reflex for adjustment. But this one had adjusted. It meant he could feel the fire while it was happening. It meant he was aware of it not as something he produced, but as something he guided. That was not a hatchling's ability. That was barely an adult ability. Rail had watched senior dragon soldiers fail to demonstrate that kind of control in live fire exercises. Commander Dravis spoke from the evaluation platform. His voice was calm and not unkind. He said that the candidate did not meet the minimum threshold for consideration. He said it clearly and without performance. He directed the hatchling to the exit corridor on the east side of the arena, where the unselected candidates were gathered. The hatchling did not react. He turned and walked toward the corridor with the same unhurried pace he had arrived with. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the board. He looked straight ahead, and he walked, and he disappeared into the shadow of the corridor. The next portion of the ceremony began. The board moved on. Rail closed his notepad, capped his pen, and stood up. He made his way down through the side passages of the arena, following the route he had mentally mapped when he first arrived. It took him 6 minutes to reach the east exit corridor, another 2 to find the holding area where the unselected candidates had gathered. There were 4 of them. 3 were grouped together near the far wall, talking in low voices, the specific mix of anger and shame that came from being publicly found insufficient. The 4th was sitting apart from them, near the entrance, with his back to the group and his eyes on the ground between his front claws. Rail walked over and stopped a few feet away. The pale-scaled hatchling looked up. His eyes were amber, steady, and not particularly interested. Rail said, "My name is Rail Dorn. I'm a captain with the Human Expeditionary Force. I was watching your evaluation." The hatchling said nothing. Rail said, "You adjusted the flame mid-breath. I want to know if you knew you were doing it, or if it was automatic." A pause. Then, "I knew." Rail nodded slowly. That was the answer he had thought he would get. That was the answer that changed things. He reached into his jacket and produced a small data slate, the size of his palm, already loaded. He set it on the stone in front of the hatchling and took a step back. "That has the details of my unit's next deployment. We leave in 48 hours. If you want to come as an observer, not a soldier, not a recruit, just an observer, the offer is open until we leave." The hatchling looked at the slate, then at Rail. His expression did not change. "You are a human." "Yes." "You live less than a century." "Most of us, yes." "And you think I should attach myself to your unit because of one observation?" "I think," Rail said, "that the board measured your fire. I don't think they measured what you can do with it. Those are different questions." He did not wait for an answer. He turned and walked back toward the arena entrance, his footsteps quiet on the old stone, the noise of the ceremony still drifting down from above. Behind him, the hatchling looked at the data slate for a long time. He did not pick it up. Not yet. Rain on Dreenath did not fall softly. It came down in heavy, warm sheets that smelled of iron and wet stone, and it lasted for hours without apology. The human base on the southern edge of the city was a collection of prefabricated structures bolted to a raised platform of local rock, practical and completely without charm. The rooftops shed water in loud curtains. The drainage channels ran fast and brown. Inside the main operations building, the unit was preparing gear for the deployment. Rail stood at the planning table with a topographical map pulled up on the display, marking routes with a stylus, not speaking. Ren Tallis was across the table from him, checking supply manifests on her own slate, occasionally making small sounds of disagreement with what she found there. Ren was a few years younger than Rail and several degrees more openly impatient. She was good at her job in the specific way that people who have never once done their job carelessly are good at their job. She also had strong opinions, and she expressed them at a normal volume, which Rail had long since stopped considering a problem. She looked up from her slate. "The hatchling isn't coming." "Probably not," Rail said. "You left a data slate with a dragon who just got publicly rejected by the most important institution on his world, and you told him he could tag along with a human unit as an observer. You understand how that sounds to him." "I understand exactly how it sounds." "Then why?" Rail marked another route on the map. Because I'm right about what I saw, and if I'm right, he'll come. Ren looked at him for a moment, then went back to her manifest. And if he doesn't? Then I was wrong, and it doesn't matter. The rain continued. The hours passed. The unit loaded equipment into the transport vehicle in shifts, working around the weather without complaining about it, because complaining about weather on Dreenath was a waste of energy that everyone had agreed on without needing to say so. 46 hours after Rail had left the data slate on the holding area floor, with 2 hours remaining before departure, someone knocked on the outer door of the operations building. It was not a sound any of the unit's members would have made. It was too heavy, too deliberate. Rail set down his stylus and walked to the door and opened it. The pale-scaled hatchling stood in the rain. The data slate was in his left foreclaw, held out slightly, the way a person might hold something they intended to return. He was soaked through, which made his pale scales look almost silver in the flat gray light. His amber eyes were direct. He said, "I will observe for one mission." Rail said, "Come in." He stepped aside. The hatchling entered, ducking his head under the doorframe. He was not comfortable doing it, but he did it without comment. Inside, the warmth of the building and the smell of human food and equipment hit him all at once, and his nostrils flared briefly before he controlled the reaction. 3 members of the unit were in the room. They all stopped what they were doing. Rail said, simply, "This is Scorch. He's coming as an observer on the deployment. Ren, he'll need a designated position in the transport." He paused. "What do you want to be called?" The hatchling, Scorch, looked at him. "That is my name. Scorch. It was given to me before the evaluation, when my family still believed I would produce fire worth naming." No one in the room said anything to that. Rail nodded. "Scorch. Ren is my second. Anything you need during the mission, you go through her or me." Ren put down her manifest. She looked at Scorch with an expression that was not hostile, but was not warm either. It was the expression of someone doing a very fast mental calculation about risk versus benefit and not yet having a result. She said, "You understand observer means you do not engage. You do not act. You watch." Scorch looked at her. "I understood the word." Ren looked at Rail. Rail did not react. She picked her manifest back up. The next 2 hours were preparation, and Scorch moved through them quietly, staying near the edge of any room he entered, watching everything. The other unit members were not unfriendly, but they were careful. They moved around him with the specific awareness of people who knew that one wrong step near a dragon, even a small one, had consequences. Scorch noticed this and said nothing about it. The transport vehicle was a 6-wheeled ground carrier, armored and designed for rough terrain. It was large by human standards. Scorch folded himself into the rear cargo section with difficulty and sat with his wings pressed flat and his tail curled against the wall. It was uncomfortable. He gave no indication of this. They drove south through the rain for 4 hours, heading for the outer continental region that the briefing maps labeled as the Ardath Corridor. The corridor was a long stretch of broken terrain between 2 raised ridges, covering about 300 kilometers of mixed forest, rock shelf, and dry river basin. It had been relatively quiet for most of the past decade. In the last 8 months, it had become a serious problem. The native predator population in that region had shifted. No one was entirely sure why. Ecological pressure, changes in prey movement, something deeper in the food chain that hadn't been identified yet. But the result was visible. The armored 6-limbed hunters that the local dragon settlements called Stonebacks had started ranging further than their historical territory, moving in larger packs, and hitting outposts that they had always ignored before. 2 dragon settlements near the corridor's northern end had reported casualties. A human supply depot halfway down the western ridge had been hit 3 times in 60 days. The human unit had been assigned to establish a patrol pattern and figure out what was happening. Simple in theory, less simple in terrain that had more ambush angles than a map could convey. Scorch listened to the mission briefing through the cargo wall as Rail gave it to the unit. He could hear the map references, the patrol routes, the rules of engagement. He had excellent hearing, which the humans did not appear to know. He noted the terrain features Rail described. He noted the patrol route. He began, quietly, to think about the corridors and the angles, the way the rock formations would funnel movement, the places where a pack would logically choose to wait. He did not say anything. He was an observer. But he cataloged everything, because that was something he had always done, and old habits did not stop simply because a door had closed behind you. The rain stopped around midnight. By the time the transport reached the staging point at the edge of the Ardath corridor, the sky had cleared to a deep, star-heavy dark. Dreenath's 2 moons were both up, casting enough silver light to read by if you needed to. The unit unloaded and set up a small camp near a rock shelf that provided good overhead coverage. Rail walked the perimeter once, quietly, checking angles. Scorch stood outside the camp's edge and looked at the terrain ahead. The ridges rose on either side, dark shapes against the lighter sky. The corridor floor below was a mix of gray stone and scrubbed flat vegetation. Ren came to stand near him, not next to him, but close enough to speak without raising her voice. She was looking at the same terrain. She said, "You're not what I expected." Scorch said, "What did you expect?" "Something that needed to be managed." He said nothing. "You're going to be harder to categorize than that," she said. She didn't sound troubled by it. She sounded like she was updating a file in her head. She went back to camp. Scorch continued to look at the corridor. The stonebacks were out there. He could not see them, but he had studied the reports during the drive, reading over Ren's shoulder when she wasn't paying attention, and he had a good idea of where they would be. He would observe, he had said. He intended to keep that promise. For now. The Ardath corridor had a particular kind of silence in the early morning. Not quiet. Exactly. Birds called from somewhere up on the ridgeline. Wind moved through the low scrub along the rock floor, and the occasional crack of cooling stone broke the stillness in the deeper shadows. But underneath all of it was something that felt like held breath, like the terrain itself was waiting. The unit had been moving for 3 hours before anything happened. The patrol route took them along the base of the western ridge, through a section of the corridor where the rock walls narrowed and the floor dropped into a dry riverbed about 4 meters below the main path. On the left, the ridge face was solid stone, almost vertical. On the right, the path edge dropped away sharply into the riverbed. Ahead, the path curved around a large rock formation, and beyond that, the corridor opened back up. Rail had marked this section on his map the night before. Narrow approach, reduced visibility around the curve, natural choke point. He had noted it as a location to move through quickly and with attention. They did not move through it quickly enough. The stonebacks came from both sides at once. They had been waiting in the riverbed, below the path's edge, and on the ledges above where the rock face was not as vertical as it appeared from a distance. 6 of them, then 8. Then the unit realized there were more still moving in from the direction of the curve ahead. The pack had staged itself correctly. It had blocked the forward exit, the retreat, and any lateral movement simultaneously. Stonebacks were the size of large horses. Their 6 legs were built for gripping uneven terrain, and their armored hides made small arms fire largely useless unless you hit the joints or the underside. Their heads were low and wide, equipped with crushing jaw structures designed for cracking open the shells of the giant burrowing prey they normally hunted. They were not built to kill humans. They had simply learned, recently, that humans were easier to catch. Rail gave orders quickly and clearly. The unit compressed into the widest section of the path they had, putting their backs together, forming a tight circle, covering fire at the joints. Make them wary, make them hesitate, buy time to identify an exit. Rail was calculating this in the 3 seconds he had for calculating. His options were a tactical retreat through the pack's back line. Difficult, likely costly, or holding position and hoping the fire damage from the unit's weapons eventually turned the pack's behavior. Stonebacks were not stupid animals. But stonebacks were also pack hunters, and a pack that had invested in a staged ambush would not simply back down because 2 or 3 of its members were limping. He said, clearly, to nobody specific, "We need a fire solution that doesn't touch the path edge." It was not an order. It was a problem spoken aloud, which was something Rail did when he wanted his unit thinking, not just executing. He had not been speaking to Scorch. Scorch had been positioned at the rear of the group, in observer mode, exactly as agreed. He had said nothing during the engagement setup. He had watched the stonebacks take their positions with the same focused quiet he brought to everything. He had watched Rail assess the terrain. He had listened to the problem. He breathed. Not at the scrub, not at the stonebacks directly. He breathed at a specific point between 2 rock formations on the left side of the path, where a section of dry root system was exposed through a crack in the stone face. His flame was narrow, genuinely narrow, the width of his own foreleg at most, and he bent it on the exhale, angling it left, dropping it between the two formations with a precision that no one watching would have believed was intentional unless they had been watching his eyes first. The root system caught. Then the dry grass in the immediate area behind the pack's lead animal, behind it, not around it or in front of it, caught. Within seconds there was a wall of fire at the stoneback's rear left position, not touching the path edge, positioned so that the heat and the light and the noise hit the lead animal from behind. The lead animal had been mid-charge. It stopped. When a pack hunter stops mid-charge, the animals behind it also stop, because the behavioral signal that a lead animal has stopped is one of the most fundamental signals in any pack's communication. The ripple of hesitation moved through the ambush in less than 2 seconds. Stonebacks scattered sideways. The ones at the rear broke entirely, moving away from the unexpected fire at their backs. The ones at the front were now disorganized and exposed, and the human unit did not waste the moment. The engagement ended in under 2 minutes. No casualties. After the last stoneback had retreated into the riverbed and the sound of their movement had faded, the unit was quiet for a moment. The small fire Scorch had started was already dying against the rock face, consuming its fuel and finding nothing else to take. Ren turned to look at Scorch. Her expression was not the expression of someone who was surprised by what they had just seen. It was the expression of someone who was reviewing new information very carefully before deciding what to do with it. She said, "Did you plan that?" Scorch said, "I planned it when we entered the ravine. I identified the fire lane before we were surrounded." Ren was quiet for a moment. "You saw the ambush set up before it triggered. The ledge positions were occupied. The scrub patterns at the path edge had been disturbed from below. The pack had been waiting for at least 2 hours." She looked at Rail. Rail was looking at Scorch with an expression that was very contained and very focused, which for Rail was approximately the equivalent of another person's visible astonishment. He said, "You were told to observe." "You stated a problem," Scorch said. "Observation includes response to direct information requests." Another brief silence. Then Rail said, "Fair enough," and turned to lead the unit forward through the now clear path. Ren fell into step. The others followed. The patrol continued. An hour later, a Royal Guard patrol passed overhead on the ridge above them. 2 large adult dragons in full guard markings, making a sweep of the corridor as part of their standard assignment. They circled once, saw the human unit moving through the terrain below, and continued on without pausing. To them, the stone backpack had been driven off by the human unit's weapons. The scorch mark on the rock face was consistent with standard fire support. They did not look at Scorch. They did not see anything unusual. That evening, back at the staging camp, Rail wrote his incident report with the same level of detail he brought to all his reports. He noted the ambush, the terrain problem, the fire solution, and the specific action taken by the attached observer. He noted the precision of the flame, the advanced identification of the ambush position, and the deliberate use of fire placement to redirect rather than destroy. He submitted the report through the standard chain. It was received and logged. No response came from the Royal Guard. Scorch was sitting at the edge of camp when Rail finished the report. He was looking at the corridor again, the way he often looked at open terrain, not restlessly, but with the steady attention of someone who was still working through something in their head. Rail sat down nearby, not next to him, but close enough for a quiet conversation. He said, "The board measured the size of your flame." Scorch said, "Yes. They didn't ask you to hit a specific point at a specific angle under pressure." "No, they did not." "If they had," Rail said, "what do you think would have happened?" Scorch was quiet for a moment. "I think the result would have been different." "Yeah," Rail said. "I think so too." He stood up and went back inside. Scorch stayed where he was for a while, watching the corridor. The moons came up. The night settled in. He did not move until well after the rest of the unit had gone to sleep. And when he did, it was simply to shift his weight and settle into something that, for a dragon, passed for rest. He was not at peace. But he was, for the first time in a long time, something that was adjacent to it. 3 weeks passed. Nobody formally announced that Scorch had joined the unit. There was no paperwork, no ceremony, no entry in the official roster. He had come as an observer for one mission, and the mission had ended, and he had not left. That was the whole of it. The unit adapted around this fact the way water adapts around a stone, without drama, with complete practicality. He ate with them, which was awkward for a while. Not because anyone objected, but because the logistics were complicated. Scorch's dietary needs were not compatible with the unit's ration supply, and for the first week he had been disappearing into the hills at mealtimes and returning without explanation. Ren had eventually addressed this directly by simply asking him what he needed. He had told her. She had made 2 calls, filed 1 request through an unusual supply channel, and the problem had been solved. She did not make a point of it. He did not thank her for it. They simply moved on to the next thing, which was how Ren preferred to operate, and, it turned out, how Scorch preferred to operate as well. He could fold himself into the transport now without it looking quite so much like a problem. He had found a way to angle his wings and curve his tail that fit the space more comfortably, and he had stopped ducking his head at doorways because he had learned that every doorway in the human base was just high enough for him if he tilted slightly left. He did not comment on these adjustments, and neither did anyone else. Ren started talking to him directly around the end of the first week. Not warmly, but honestly, which for Ren meant there was no gap between what she was thinking and what she was saying. She asked him questions about his evaluation, about his training before it, about what the Royal Guard selection process had involved. He answered clearly. When she asked something he did not want to answer, he said so. She accepted that without pushing. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not find her irritating. What Scorch had not told anyone, not Rael, not Ren, not any of the others, was the thing that had always made him different from every other dragon hatchling he had known. He could feel fire. Not feel it in the way every dragon felt it, the physical sensation of heat and the instinctive awareness of temperature. He meant something more precise than that. When he breathed fire, he experienced the structure of it. The differential between the hottest part of the flame at its center and the cooler edge at the outside. The specific degree at which a particular type of material would ignite versus the degree at which it would simply char. The way a flame moved in still air versus the way it bent in a crosswind. The exact moment when a fire had consumed its available fuel and would die without further source. He had always assumed this was universal. He had grown up believing that all dragons experienced fire this way, that the ability to feel the structure of a flame was simply what fire breath was. It had taken him years to understand, slowly and without anyone directly telling him, that this was not true. Other dragons did not feel what he felt. They produced fire. They aimed it, roughly, and released it. The flame went where instinct sent it. His flame went where he decided to send it. While it was still happening, in real time, he could adjust mid-breath the way a skilled craftsman adjusted a tool mid-use, with the same awareness and the same intentionality. The problem was that his flame was small. In a world that measured fire by volume and temperature, his precise control was invisible because the output was unimpressive. The board had seen a thin pale flame and recorded, insufficient. They were not wrong by their own measurement. They had simply never thought to ask a different question. He was thinking about this when the Royal Guard vehicle landed at the base. It was late afternoon. The unit was doing maintenance on their equipment, nothing dramatic, just the daily upkeep that kept gear functional. The guard vehicle was a fast single-seat Scout, green and gold in guard colors, and it touched down on the base's landing pad with a confidence that suggested the pilot had not considered that he might be unwelcome. He was not unwelcome. He was simply unexpected. Lieutenant Grawl was young for his rank, which in the guard meant he was exceptionally physically capable and knew it. His scales were a deep copper color, polished looking, and he wore his guard rank markings on his chest harness with the precision of someone who had spent real-time positioning them. He had been assigned to an inter-service coordination role, which meant he was here to attend a meeting with Rael about joint patrol scheduling in the Ardath Corridor's northern section. He saw Scorch within 30 seconds of landing. The recognition was immediate. They were from the same evaluation cohort. Grawl had been the third hatchling called to the arena floor. He had produced an extremely impressive flame. He had scored high across every category and had been selected for the guard in the first round. He looked at Scorch for a moment. Then he looked at the human base around them. Then he looked at Rael. He said, in a voice that was not quiet, "You brought a rejected hatchling onto your unit." Rael said, "He's attached as a specialist observer." He was rejected, Grawl said, as though Rail had perhaps not understood the word the first time. By the board. Minimum threshold for the Royal Guard evaluation. He looked at Scorch again. You are aware that attaching yourself to a human unit is not a path to the Guard. It is not a path to anything within Dragon military structure. Scorch said nothing. Grawl addressed the wider space, which included several members of the unit who had stopped their work and were standing still. Humans, he said, respect strength because they lack it themselves. They are practical creatures, and they understand what they cannot match. But they do not have the ability to evaluate dragon ability. They are not equipped for it. This is not an insult. It is simply accuracy. The unit was very quiet. Not the quiet of people who agreed. The quiet of people who had decided, collectively, to allow their captain to handle this in his own way. Rail said, "Come on a patrol with us tomorrow. Observe." Grawl looked at him. "You are inviting me to observe your unit." "Yes." "I do not need to observe a human patrol unit to form an accurate assessment." "Then come and be right in person," Rail said. "Better than being right at a distance." Something in the phrasing landed differently than Grawl had expected. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I will attend the morning patrol." As an observer. The word observer had a deliberate weight when he said it. Scorch caught Rail's eye from across the yard. Rail gave no visible reaction. He just turned and went back inside to continue the meeting that Grawl had technically been sent here to attend. The morning patrol went north, into a section of the corridor that had been flagged for a specific incident 2 days earlier, a collapsed structure near an old dragon settlement, the kind of half-abandoned outpost that dotted Dreenath's outer continent, still technically inhabited by a small group of local families who hadn't wanted to relocate to the main city. A storage building had come down in a tremor. One of the settlement's younglings had been trapped in the lower section. The adults had tried to dig him out and stopped when they identified a volatile gas pocket in the debris. Flammable, concentrated, exactly the kind of hazard that made everything worse the moment someone breathed fire near it. They had called for help 2 days ago. The guard had not been able to route anyone to it yet. The human unit was close enough. Grawl watched from above as the unit approached the collapsed structure. He had been given a simple observer position. Stay elevated, watch, do not interfere unless directly necessary. He had accepted this with an expression of patient endurance. The gas pocket was real. Rail confirmed it with the unit's sensors within the first minute. The youngling was real too. They could hear him, small distressed sounds from the lower section of the collapse, alive and unhurt, but stuck under a beam that had pinned his left wing. Normal approach, impossible. Fire would ignite the gas and kill the youngling. Digging without removing the gas first risked a structural shift that would do the same. It was a problem that required a specific solution, and the specific solution was not something the unit's standard equipment could provide. Scorch moved forward before anyone assigned him a role. He went to the edge of the debris field and went still. He was reading the airflow, the gas distribution, the specific places where the concentration was highest and where it was thinner. He was doing the same thing he always did, seeing the structure of the problem the way he saw the structure of fire. He began breathing in small, controlled bursts. Not to ignite, to burn away. He targeted the thinner pockets at the perimeter of the debris field first, eliminating the fuel at the edges, working inward, reducing the total concentration in a deliberate pattern that took 8 minutes. The micro-bursts were barely visible. They produced almost no visible flame. To Grawl above, watching, it would have looked like very little was happening. What was happening was that the gas pocket was ceasing to exist section by section in a precise, methodical reduction that left the core debris field safe to approach. When Scorch stepped back and said, simply, "It is clear to the inner section," Rail moved the unit in immediately. They dug out the beam with the unit's equipment. The youngling was frightened and bruised but uninjured. He was handed to the settlement adults who had been waiting at the perimeter. The flight back to base was quiet. Grawl landed with them and stood in the yard for a moment after disembarking. He looked at Scorch. He looked at Rail. He did not say that he had been wrong. He did not say that his assessment needed adjustment. He was a Royal Guard officer, and he had a specific image of himself that did not include being wrong in front of a human unit. But his eyes were different from when he had arrived. He said, "I will file my coordination report this afternoon." Rail said, "Thank you for coming." Grawl left. His scout vehicle lifted off and banked north. Ren came to stand beside Rail. What do you think he writes? I don't know, Rail said honestly. Scorch was watching the scout vehicle disappear into the afternoon sky. He had no idea what Grawl would write. He had stopped expecting anything from the Royal Guard and its representatives a long time ago. But something about Grawl's eyes on the way out had been different. Not agreement, not acceptance, just different. And different, Scorch had learned from watching humans, was always where everything started. The first sign was the sound. It reached the human base at dawn, a low grinding vibration that came up through the ground before it came through the air, the kind of sound that the body registers before the ears do. Rail felt it in the soles of his feet as he stood at the planning table running his morning review. He stopped. He waited. It came again, deeper. Ren was already at the comm unit by the time the guard emergency frequency lit up. The word that came across it was faultline surge. Rail had read about faultline surges in his orientation materials 3 years ago, in a section titled Known Geological and Biological Events, DRENAF. He had read it, processed it, filed it, and not thought about it much since, because faultline surges had a documented recurrence interval of roughly 70 years, and the last one had been 63 years ago. He had considered it a background fact, the kind of low-probability catastrophe that career soldiers knew about and hoped to never see. He was seeing it now. The surge had opened 3 kilometers north of Athrid, the second largest dragon city on the continent. Deep below Drenath's surface, networks of tunnels stretched for hundreds of kilometers, carved over thousands of years by a species of massive burrowing creatures that the dragons called ground splitters. Ground splitters were not aggressive by nature. They were enormous, heavily armored, and almost completely blind, and they moved through the deep earth eating mineral deposits and each other. Under normal conditions, they never came to the surface. When a faultline surge happened, normal conditions ended. Geological shifts, pressure changes in the deep rock, seismic activity, temperature fluctuations from volcanic systems, destabilized the tunnel networks and forced the ground splitters upward. They came through the surface in groups, dozens at a time, sometimes hundreds. They were the size of large buildings, and they were panicking, which made them extremely dangerous, because panicking creatures that size did not make precise decisions about where they moved. The Royal Guard was already mobilizing. The comm traffic was dense and fast, Guard commanders coordinating strike positions, establishing perimeter lines around the surge entry points, directing their heaviest fire units toward the primary breach. The plan was saturation, mass flame strikes at every entry point to seal the breaches with heat and force the remaining ground splitters back underground or eliminate them on the surface. It was a good plan for most of the surge entry points. Rail was looking at the tactical map. There were 4 breach points. 3 of them were in open ground north of the city, accessible, surrounded by space that could absorb a mass flame strike without secondary consequences. The 4th was different. It was a secondary fissure, smaller than the main breach, positioned at the eastern edge of the city's outer district. The Guard's map had it marked as a lower priority, smaller creatures, fewer numbers, manageable with a medium strike team. What the Guard's map did not mark, because it was infrastructure data rather than tactical data, and the 2 systems had not been cross-referenced, was that the city's central water processing facility sat 40 meters from the edge of that fissure. The facility ran a network of pressurized pipes through the surrounding area. High-temperature water, high pressure, running through a distribution system that covered the entire eastern residential district. A mass flame saturation at that fissure would not just push back the ground splitters. The heat would transfer through the ground to the pipes. Pressurized water heated fast enough did not simply boil. It turned into a pressure event. The pipes would fail. The distribution network would fail. And the eastern residential district, dense, populated, full of civilians who had moved inside when the alarm sounded, would be directly under the resulting rupture. Rail put it together in 4 minutes, working from the tactical map and the infrastructure layout that he had been given during a base security briefing 8 months earlier. He stared at it for a moment to make sure he was not wrong. He was not wrong. He got on the comm and asked to be connected to Guard Command. He was placed in a holding queue. He was a human captain. The Guard's command network was dealing with a fault line surge at a major city. The queue was long and nobody was prioritizing a foreign liaison request. He tried twice more. Same result. He sent a written flag through the inter-service channel. It was received and logged. Scorch had been standing near the doorway. He had heard everything. He had excellent hearing, which the humans had known for about a week now. He had also been doing the math since Rail stopped talking, and Rail was right. The pipe system heat transfer calculation was straightforward physics. The failure pressure threshold of the distribution network was something Scorch had encountered once in a technical document about Athrid's construction, which he had read because he read most things that came across the base's open information channel. The timeline was not comfortable. If the guard strike team hit the eastern fissure on the same schedule as the other 3 points, the window for avoiding the secondary rupture was closing fast. Scorch walked outside. He stood in the base yard for a moment. The grinding vibration was continuous now, felt more than heard. The sky to the north had a low dust haze rising from the breach sites. Guard units were crossing overhead in formation, heavy fire dragons moving fast in coordinated lines. He thought about the fissure. He thought about what he could do at the fissure. He did not have the flame volume to drive back ground splitters directly. Even adult Royal Guard dragons, with their enormous output, were managing that with difficulty and numbers. What he had was not useful for direct confrontation, but he did not need to drive them back. He needed to move them sideways. A ground splitter moved toward lower temperature. That was its primary directional instinct when disoriented near the surface. It moved away from heat and toward cool. A shaped thermal barrier, a corridor of temperature differential, would guide their movement the same way a fence guided livestock. Not forced, guided. If the corridor was shaped correctly, it would push the ground splitters emerging from the eastern fissure not back down into the earth, but sideways, north, away from the water infrastructure, into the open ground where the guard's main force was already operating and could handle them. He just needed to hold the corridor until the guard's main force extended its reach. He was aware this was not guaranteed to work. He was also aware of what happened to the eastern residential district if nobody tried. He said nothing to anyone. He ran to the edge of the landing pad, opened his wings, and flew. Rail came out of the building 90 seconds later and looked at the empty yard. He looked at the sky. He saw the pale-scaled shape climbing fast toward the north, aimed directly at the eastern fissure. He said, very quietly, one word that it would not be useful to repeat, and then he turned around and started shouting orders. Scorch reached the fissure ahead of the guard strike team by what he estimated was about 6 minutes. The fissure was a long crack in the eastern ground, already wide, already producing its first ground splitters. They were enormous. He had known they were enormous. Knowing and seeing were different things. Each one was as wide as the human base building and as long as the base itself. They moved with the panicked urgency of creatures in severe distress, which made them unpredictable at the edge of their emergence, but gave them a consistent directional preference, away from the surface light, away from the heat, toward anywhere that felt more like the deep earth they understood. He built the barrier on the left side of the fissure first. Not a wall of fire, a corridor, a narrow channel of sustained precise heat on the left, which encouraged movement to the right. Then a second line on the right flank of the emerging creatures, pushing them into the center channel. He adjusted constantly, reading the thermal feedback the way he always had, feeling the temperature differential between the barrier heat and the cooler air inside the corridor, correcting whenever a shift in wind or a ground splitter's movement broke the alignment. He was not hurting them. He was steering them, north, away from the infrastructure, into open ground. It worked. It worked because his flame was exactly what it had always been, precise, controlled, and deeply responsive to his awareness of it. A larger flame would have been less useful here. A larger flame could not be shaped into a corridor this narrow at this sustained temperature without becoming destructive at the edges. What he had was exactly the right tool. He held the corridor for 11 minutes. At 7 minutes, his output began to drop. His reserves were not built for sustained effort at this duration. His flame grew thinner, the temperature differential narrowed, and the barrier began to lose its definition. He corrected as hard as he could. He kept it together through sheer knowledge of where every degree of remaining heat needed to go. At 9 minutes, the edges of the corridor started to collapse. At 10 minutes, he heard the human transport. The unit arrived at the fissure edge as Scorch's flame finally gave out. For a moment the corridor was only warmth, no active barrier, and 2 of the ground splitters began to drift left toward the infrastructure. The human unit placed itself in the gap. They used their equipment, flare launchers, high-temperature directed charges, two handheld thermal units that were designed for cutting rock and were deeply inappropriate for this use, but produced enough heat signature to register to a groundsplitter's instincts. Rin ran the placement herself, moving the team with rapid precision, putting the thermal line exactly where Scorch's barrier had been, holding it for the 3 minutes it took Scorch to recover enough to breathe again. He came back into position at the 11-minute mark. His flame was thin and pale, thinner than usual, emptied and rebuilding. But it was enough. The corridor held. The guard's main force reached the open ground to the north at 12 minutes. They engaged the redirected ground splitters with their full fire output in a space that had no secondary hazards. It was straightforward at that point. Loud and enormous and straightforward. The eastern fissure sealed itself an hour later, the ground splitter pressure from below decreasing as the geological event ran its course. The city's water processing facility was intact. The eastern residential district was intact. When the guard strike team finally reached the eastern fissure, late, rerouted from another breach, they found a small human unit and one pale-scaled hatchling in the zone. The strike team leader looked at the ground splitter tracks in the soil. He looked at the direction of travel. He looked at the fissure. He looked at Scorch, who was sitting on the ground with his head low, completely spent, breathing slow and steady. He did not say anything, but he took out his slate and he recorded what he saw. All of it, with detail. Rail sat down next to Scorch on the ground. He did not say anything for a long moment. Scorch said, "I should have told you before I left." "Yes," Rail said. "I did not have time to explain and debate. You could have explained on the way." A pause. "Yes, I could have." Rail looked at the sealed fissure and the ground splitter tracks leading north into open ground. The corridor held. For most of it. For enough of it, Rail said. Scorch said nothing. He was too tired for conversation, and Rail understood this. And so they sat together in the dust at the edge of a sealed geological event in the outer district of the second largest city on Dreenath, and they were quiet for a while, which was its own kind of thing. The after-action reports were filed by 4 different parties that day. The Guard Strike Team Leader, the Guard Command's Debriefing Officer, Rentalis, Rail Dorn. They all said the same thing, in different language, with different levels of detail. The Eastern Residential District had been saved by a pale-scale dragon hatchling with a small flame and a precise mind, supported by a human unit that arrived when it mattered. This time, the reports did not go unread. For days after the fault line surge, Commander Dravis came to the human base alone. No escort, no formal guard. He arrived in a standard guard transport, not the ceremonial vehicle that senior commanders used for official visits, and he landed in the base yard and walked to the operations building without being announced. The guard at the entrance recognized his rank and stepped aside without requiring him to stop. Rail was at his planning table when Dravis entered. He stood. That was habit and courtesy and nothing else. Dravis looked around the building briefly. It was a practical space. Maps, equipment, supply stacks, a long table with mismatched chairs that had been accumulated rather than issued. It smelled like human food and work and the particular kind of institutional order that came from a small group of people who had learned each other's habits. There was a section near the far wall where Scorch's presence had clearly made its mark. A cleared space, a larger arrangement, some reinforced modifications to the flooring that the unit had done quietly and without complaint. Dravis said, "Where is the hatchling?" Rail said, "Outside. He prefers open air when he is resting." Dravis nodded. "I would like to speak with both of you." They walked outside together. Scorch was at the edge of the yard, sitting in the late afternoon sun in the same quiet way he always occupied space. Present, still, not particularly interested in performing anything for anyone. He looked at Dravis when they came out. His expression did not change. Dravis stopped a few meters away. He did not sit, because there was nothing in the yard sized for him to sit on. He stood with the straightness of someone who had been in command for so long that the posture had become structural. He said, "I have reviewed the after-action reports from the surge event. All of them, including the infrastructure analysis that Captain Dorn flagged before the event and was unable to get routed to command in time." He paused. That flag was correct. If the Guard Strike Team had reached the Eastern Fissure on schedule and proceeded with standard saturation, The residential district outcome would have been what the captain's analysis predicted. He looked at Scorch. I also reviewed the thermal imaging from the Fisher site. The corridor you built was 11 minutes long. The precision of it, the maintenance of a consistent temperature differential across an uneven geological surface while managing multiple emergence points simultaneously, is not a feat that I could attribute to volume of output. Another pause. I could not do what you did at that Fisher. I want to be clear about that. My flame is large. It would have been the wrong tool. Scorch was quiet for a moment. The board's evaluation did not include a scenario requiring that tool. No, Travis said. It did not. The board's evaluation is designed to measure power. It has been designed that way for longer than I have been associated with it, and the reasoning behind that design is not without validity. Power wins most engagements. Power is reliable in most scenarios. Power is what the guard was built around, and what the guard has used effectively for generations. He paused again, and this pause had a different quality, the pause of a man who was saying something he had spent time reaching and was not going to undercut with hedging. But the guard has a gap. It has always had a gap. It encountered that gap 4 days ago, and survived it only because there happened to be, in the right place at the right time, a capability that we had rejected. Scorch said nothing. I am offering you a position in the Royal Guard, Travis said. Not the standard entry track. That is not what I am describing. What I am describing is the formation of a specialist unit, small, precision-focused, built around unconventional capabilities rather than standard power metrics. You would be the first member of that unit, possibly the ranking member, once it is fully constituted. He held eye contact. I am also acknowledging, plainly, that the evaluation system that rejected you was using the wrong measurement for your particular ability. That is a deficiency in the evaluation system. I intend to address it. The yard was quiet. A bird called from somewhere on the ridge beyond the base. Wind moved through the equipment racks. Scorch looked at Travis for a long time. He did not look grateful. He did not look vindicated. He looked like someone who was thinking carefully, and taking the time to think carefully rather than reacting, which was something he had in common with exactly one human in the base behind him. He said, one condition. Travis said, state it. Captain Rail Dorn and his unit are attached to the specialist unit as joint partners. Not under guard command. Not as subordinates. Partners, with equal standing in joint operations and equal voice in mission planning. Travis looked at Rail. Rail was leaning against the wall of the operations building with his arms folded, watching this without expression. When Travis looked at him, he did not move or change his posture. He simply waited. Travis said, you are asking me to establish a formal joint human-dragon command structure within Royal Guard operations. I am asking for what the Eastern Fisher demonstrated was effective, Scorch said. They held the corridor when I could not. I identified the problem when your command structure could not receive the information. The capability that saved the residential district was not mine alone and was not theirs alone. It was both. Travis was quiet for a moment. He looked at the yard, at the base, at the practical, unglamorous, functional evidence of a unit that had been doing its job carefully and without recognition for 3 years. He said, the administrative framework for this will require significant work. I expect it will, Scorch said. There will be resistance from elements of the Guard Command who will object to the precedent. I expect that too. Travis looked at him. Something in the old commander's expression was not quite a smile, but was the structural relative of one. You have spent time with humans, he said. It was not a criticism. Some, Scorch said. Travis looked at Rail. Captain. Rail said, Commander. You are willing to operate under this arrangement. I'm willing to operate under an arrangement that works, Rail said. That one works. I've seen it. Travis was quiet for a final moment. Then he said, agreed, in the tone of someone who had made a decision and considered it complete. He left soon after. The guard transport lifted off from the yard and banked north, toward the city, toward the guard's administrative buildings where the paperwork for unprecedented things was presumably stored. The yard was quiet. Ren appeared in the operations building doorway. She had been inside the whole time, and her expression said clearly that she had heard every word through the wall and had decided that coming outside for it would have been too obvious. She looked at Scorch. She looked at Rail. She said, administrative framework for a joint command structure. It'll take a while, Rail said. 6 months at least, she said. She did not sound troubled. She went back inside. Rail and Scorch were alone in the yard. They did not discuss what had just happened. There was not much to discuss. It had happened. It would continue to happen, in the form of meetings and documents and objections and slow official processes. And eventually, it would be a fact in the world that had not been a fact before. That was how things like this worked. Rail had enough experience with institutional change to know that the dramatic moment was never the end. It was just where the actual work started. He walked to the yard's edge, where the ground fell away slightly toward the corridor terrain below, and stood looking at the late sky. Scorch walked over and stood nearby. The sun was low, throwing long flat shadows across the stone ground, turning the pale dust orange. Scorch breathed a small flame into the open air. It was exactly what it had always been. Narrow, pale at the edges, precisely controlled. The size of a candle at its tip, broadening slightly through its length, sustained for a long moment without wavering. In the low light, it was actually visible in a way that it wasn't in full daylight. The specific clean color of it, the precision of its edges, the way it held its shape against the evening wind without dispersing. He watched it. He said, "They measured the fire." Rail said, "Yeah. Nobody asked what I could do with it. That's usually how it goes." Scorch held the flame for another moment. The wind picked up slightly, and it bent, not randomly, but in a controlled lean, adjusting to the new pressure the way a skilled hand adjusts to a changed angle. Still burning, still shaped, still exactly what he wanted it to be. He let it die. The yard was still. Somewhere to the north, Athrid's lights were beginning to come on against the darkening sky. The city going about the business of surviving and continuing that cities always went about. The water processing facility was running. The residential district was intact. For reports had been filed, and one commander had made a decision, and the administrative framework would take 6 months at least. Rail stayed where he was for another minute. Then he went inside. Scorch stayed in the yard as the last light left the sky, in the particular stillness of someone who has been told, after a very long time, that the thing they always were was the thing that was needed. Not celebrated, not given a ceremony, just needed. He had decided, standing in a rejection pen in the rain 46 hours after a human captain had left a data slate on the ground in front of him, that he would observe one mission. He had been observing ever since. He did not think he would stop.